The room was cloaked in lamplight, heavy with the scent of smoke and ink. Papers lay strewn across the desk, each line a frantic attempt to hold a nation together. In that silence, a tall, weary figure bent over a letter that could decide the fate of millions. Abraham Lincoln, once a rail splitter in the wilderness, now stood at the edge of history, facing a question no man had ever answered. How do you bind a country already breaking apart? The story of Abraham Lincoln begins not in marble halls or bustling cities, but in a crude log cabin in the Kentucky wilderness. Born on February 12, 1809, near Hodgenville, Lincoln's earliest world was one of hard soil, rough timber, and unrelenting struggle. His father, Thomas Lincoln, was a farmer and carpenter, restless, hard-working, often thwarted by bad luck and shifting land titles. His mother, Nancy Hanks Lincoln, provided warmth and steady affection, though her life would prove tragically short. The frontier smelled of freshly hewn logs, damp earth after rain, and the acrid smoke of wood fires. This was no place of luxury, but of survival. Children rose before dawn to fetch water, gather wood, and tend to livestock. Abraham, tall and lanky even in youth, grew accustomed to labor, swinging axes, clearing fields, splitting rails. These early years shaped his endurance, but it was his hunger for knowledge that marked him apart. Books were scarce in the backwoods, yet Lincoln devoured whatever scraps he could find. The Bible, Aesop's fables, Shakespeare, Pilgrim's Progress. He would carry volumes with him to the fields, reading by firelight after long hours of toil. Neighbors remembered him scribbling with charcoal on wooden planks, memorizing verses, rehearsing arguments to the empty sky. Loss came early. In 1818, when Lincoln was only 9, his mother died from milk sickness, a common frontier illness. Her absence left a scar, but also an unshakable seriousness in the boy. A year later, Thomas remarried Sarah Bush Johnston, a kind and capable woman who encouraged Abraham's learning. She would later recall, he read all the books he could lay his hands on. When he came across a passage that struck him, he would write it down. In these woods and fields, Lincoln first encountered the contradictions of America, the promise of freedom and the reality of hardship, the dream of equality and the persistence of bondage. He once witnessed the sale of enslaved people during a flatboat trip to New Orleans, an image that etched itself into his conscience. The boy who grew up poor and barefoot would one day speak of liberty in words that thundered through generations. Lincoln's young adulthood was a restless search for identity. Moving with his family to Indiana, then Illinois, he found himself at the edges of communities. Tall, awkward, self-educated. In New Salem, a small frontier village, he tried his hand at storekeeping, surveying, and militia service. None brought great wealth, but they built his reputation for honesty and humor. Townsfolk called him Honest Abe, a name that stuck not because he sought it, but because he lived it. The law soon beckoned. With no formal schooling, Lincoln borrowed law books and read them by firelight. He memorized statutes, dissected cases, rehearsed arguments aloud while pacing. In 1836, he passed the Illinois bar exam. As a lawyer, he proved meticulous, logical, and deeply persuasive. Juries were often won not by flourishes, but by his clarity. His opponents noted his ability to cut through confusion, delivering arguments as simple as they were devastating. It was in courtrooms and taverns that Lincoln honed his voice. He spoke in a slow, deliberate rhythm, his words chosen with care. When he rose to speak, the room would still. His humor disarmed hostility, while his moral conviction compelled respect. These were not just skills of law. They were foundations for politics. In 1834, Lincoln was elected to the Illinois state legislature. There he aligned with the Whigs, advocating for infrastructure, banks, and modernization. Yet even as he pursued politics, he never shed the plainness of his origins. He walked with a long stride, his clothes often ill-fitted, his manner earnest. He was, as one observer said, a man without guile. It was also during these years that Lincoln encountered personal tragedy. He formed close ties with Anne Rutledge, a young woman of New Salem. Her death in 1835 from illness plunged him into grief so deep that friends feared for his sanity. Loss shadowed his steps, yet it also deepened his empathy. Those who knew him remarked on his melancholy, a quiet sadness that never entirely lifted, even in triumph, but ambition burned alongside sorrow. Lincoln declared once, "I will study and get ready, and perhaps my chance will come." That chance was gathering on the horizon as the nation itself inched closer to a storm. By the 1840s, Abraham Lincoln had risen from obscure frontier lawyer to a prominent figure in Illinois politics. His growing stature coincided with America's most pressing and divisive issue, slavery. The Missouri Compromise, the annexation of Texas, and the war with Mexico all forced the nation to confront the spread of bondage into new territories. For Lincoln, slavery was not just a political question, but a moral one. In 1846, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. It was his first step onto the national stage, though he would serve only a single term. In Washington, he opposed the Mexican-American War, denouncing it as a conflict manufactured to expand slavery's reach. His spot resolutions, demanding evidence for the war's justification, earned him ridicule from political opponents. Yet they revealed his willingness to stand against popular tides when conscience required it. Lincoln's views on slavery were cautious, shaped by the political landscape of his time. He did not initially call for immediate abolition in states where slavery already existed, but he fiercely opposed its expansion. He believed that if slavery were confined, it would eventually wither away. In one speech, he declared, "I hate it because it deprives our Republican example of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions to taunt us as hypocrites." The House of Representatives proved a difficult arena for Lincoln. His lone term left him little influence, and his opposition to the war alienated many constituents. In 1849, he returned to Springfield, resuming his legal career. He threw himself into the work with renewed vigor, traveling the 8th Judicial Circuit of Illinois, riding horseback from county to county. These years polished his skills further. He became renowned as a circuit lawyer, often entertaining fellow attorneys with humorous tales told by campfire after long days of argument. But beneath the laughter lay an increasing awareness of the nation's fracture. Each new law, each compromise patched together in Congress seemed only to postpone the reckoning. By the 1850s, the Kansas-Nebraska Act ignited fresh fury. It allowed settlers to determine whether territories would permit slavery, effectively repealing the Missouri Compromise. To Lincoln, it was a betrayal of principle. He returned to politics with a passion that startled his peers. His speeches grew more urgent, his arguments sharper. The once cautious lawyer now thundered against slavery's advance. "If the Negro is a man, why then my ancient faith teaches me that all men are created equal, and that there can be no moral right in connection with one man's making a slave of another." Thus, the stage was set. The quiet lawyer from Illinois was becoming a voice of conscience for the nation, a role that would draw him inexorably toward the storm at its center. The year 1858 brought Abraham Lincoln into direct combat with one of the most formidable politicians of his age, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Their rivalry, played out across the fields, towns, and packed halls of Illinois, would electrify the nation. Douglas was a master orator, short in stature but immense in influence. He championed popular sovereignty, the notion that settlers in new territories should decide for themselves whether to permit slavery. Lincoln, by contrast, believed such a policy was both dangerous and unjust. The nation, he argued, could not remain forever half free and half enslaved. In accepting the Republican nomination for Senate, Lincoln delivered words that would echo for generations. "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure, permanently half slave and half free." The ensuing Lincoln-Douglas debates were more than political contests. They were moral reckonings. Crowds gathered by the thousands, arriving in wagons and on horseback to hear the two men. Newspapers across the country reprinted their words, and for the first time, Lincoln's name became widely known beyond Illinois. The debates exposed Lincoln's gifts. His style was not flamboyant, but deliberate. Logic layered upon logic until even his opponents struggled to refute him. He acknowledged that slavery's end would not come swiftly, yet he insisted it must not spread further. Douglas accused him of stirring sectional strife, warning that his views threatened the Union itself. Lincoln countered that the greater danger lay in silence. Though Lincoln ultimately lost the Senate race, he won something greater, a reputation as the moral voice of a new political movement. He had shown himself capable of standing against giants, of holding crowds with his quiet force. His words carried beyond Illinois, reaching New England, the South, and the growing West. When the debates ended, Lincoln reflected not in triumph, but in resolve. "I am not bound to win," he once said, "but I am bound to be true. I am not bound to succeed, but I am bound to live by the light that I have." The House-divided speech had planted a seed. In just 2 years, it would bloom into a presidential campaign that would alter the course of history. By 1860, Lincoln was no longer a provincial lawyer, but a national figure. His debates with Douglas had earned him a reputation as a man of principle and clarity. Within the newly formed Republican Party, voices began to whisper, could this tall, self-taught man from Illinois be their candidate for president? The nation stood at a crossroads. The Democratic Party had splintered between North and South. Southern leaders demanded guarantees for the expansion of slavery. Northern Democrats struggled to maintain unity. Into this fractured landscape stepped the Republicans, who needed a figure both firm in principle and moderate in tone. Lincoln fit that role. At the Republican National Convention in Chicago, delegates gathered under the vast wooden rafters of the wigwam. Lincoln was not the front-runner. That honor belonged to William Seward of New York. But Lincoln's humble origins, eloquence, and reputation for honesty made him appealing to delegates wary of sectional extremists. Ballot by ballot, his support swelled. On the third ballot, the convention erupted. Abraham Lincoln was the Republican nominee for president. The campaign unfolded against a background of fiery division. Southern newspapers warned that Lincoln's election would be intolerable. The Black Republican Party, one editor thundered, threatens to trample upon the Constitution and destroy our way of life. Lincoln, in contrast, ran a measured campaign, emphasizing his opposition to slavery's spread without calling for its immediate abolition. His image was carefully crafted, the rail splitter who had risen through merit, a man of the people. When the results arrived in November, the outcome was decisive, though fractured. Lincoln won the electoral vote with strong support in the North, but he carried not a single Southern state. As the news spread, celebrations in northern towns mingled with ominous warnings from the South. Even before he took office, 7 Southern states declared secession. The winter of 1860 into 1861 was one of foreboding silence, broken by sudden shocks. State after state announced its departure from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. In Washington, panic mingled with paralysis. Outgoing President James Buchanan offered little resistance. The burden would fall on Lincoln. On March 4, 1861, Lincoln stood before the Capitol, its dome still unfinished, scaffolding rising behind him like a metaphor for the fragile nation. The crowd was tense, the air sharp with expectation. His inaugural address struck a careful balance, firm in principle but pleading for peace. "We are not enemies, but friends," he said. "Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Yet passion had already broken them. A month later, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The Civil War had begun. Lincoln, who had known sorrow and struggle, now faced the greatest crisis in American history. He called for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Young men streamed into camps, the smell of powder and the clatter of drums filling towns across the North. But what many imagined would be a brief campaign soon stretched into years of blood and exhaustion. As commander-in-chief, Lincoln was both cautious and bold. He studied military strategy late into the night, poring over maps. He cycled through generals, McClellan, Burnside, Hooker, seeking a leader who would fight with resolve. He endured criticism from Congress, ridicule from newspapers, and doubt even within his own cabinet. Yet he refused to waver from his central purpose, preserving the Union. By 1862, the war dragged on with no end in sight. The Union suffered staggering casualties and pressure mounted for Lincoln to strike at the heart of the rebellion, its system of slavery. To many, emancipation was a moral necessity. To others, it was reckless radicalism. Lincoln moved cautiously. He feared that premature action might push border states like Kentucky and Missouri into the Confederacy. But after the Union's hard-won victory at Antietam, he saw the moment. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Its words were measured, but their meaning thundered. All persons held as slaves within the rebellious states are, and henceforward, shall be free. The proclamation did not immediately end slavery everywhere. It applied only to states in rebellion, not to loyal border states. Yet its impact was profound. It transformed the war from a struggle for union into a crusade for freedom. It allowed African Americans to join the Union Army, tens of thousands donning blue uniforms and fighting for their liberation. The world took notice. European powers, particularly Britain and France, recoiled from supporting a confederacy now branded as a champion of slavery. Lincoln later reflected, "If my name ever goes into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." The proclamation marked a turning point. It bound the Union cause not only to survival, but to justice, and in doing so, it gave the war a moral purpose that would outlive the battlefield. The war raged on, its toll staggering. In July 1863, Union and Confederate forces clashed at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The three-day battle left over 50,000 casualties. When the smoke cleared, the rolling hills were littered with the dead. Months later, Lincoln traveled to dedicate a cemetery on that scarred ground. The day was cold, the crowd subdued. Orators spoke at length, their words filling hours. Then Lincoln rose. His address lasted scarcely 2 minutes, but in that brevity, he distilled the essence of the conflict. 74 years ago, he began, invoking the nation's founding. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and a government of the people, by the people, for the people. The audience listened in silence. Some newspapers dismissed the speech as trivial, but others sensed its power. Over time, it would come to be regarded as one of the greatest articulations of democratic purpose ever uttered. Lincoln's voice that day was not one of triumph, but of resolve. He did not glorify war. He sanctified sacrifice and bound it to the unfinished work of liberty. In the fields of Gettysburg, he gave meaning to the blood spilled and charted a vision of a nation yet to be fully realized. Lincoln's presidency was marked not only by war, but by ceaseless political strife. He faced rivals within his own party, critics in Congress, and newspapers that mocked his every move. The 1864 election loomed as a referendum not just on his leadership, but on the war itself. Weariness gripped the North. Casualties mounted, and many called for peace, even if it meant recognizing Confederate independence. Lincoln himself feared defeat. He wrote a secret memorandum, pledging to work with his successor to save the Union if he lost. Yet in the final months of the war, Union victories shifted the tide. With General Ulysses S. Grant pressing Lee in Virginia and General William Tecumseh Sherman marching through Georgia, the Union cause revived. Lincoln's re-election became a symbol of endurance. In his second inaugural address, he spoke with humility, acknowledging the shared suffering of both North and South. With malice toward none, with charity for all, he said, "Let us strive on to finish the work we are in." These words revealed Lincoln's heart. He sought not vengeance, but reconciliation. He dreamed of a nation reunited, its wounds healed, its freedom broadened. As the spring of 1865 dawned, the Confederacy crumbled. Richmond fell, and Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. Bells rang, cannons fired in celebration, crowds filled the streets with cheers. For the first time in 4 years, hope stirred. Lincoln walked among the rejoicing crowds quietly. He visited the fallen Confederate capital, greeted by freed men and women who saw him as the embodiment of liberty. A Union officer recalled the scene. They hailed him as if he were more than a man. Yet Lincoln carried himself with modesty, speaking not of victory, but of rebuilding. He urged leniency toward the defeated, warning against the poison of revenge. He told those close to him that the work ahead, binding the nation's wounds, would be harder than war itself. He seemed both weary and renewed, as though standing on the threshold of a new chapter. History, however, had other designs. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Washington glowed with celebration. The war was ending, the Union restored, and the president sought a rare moment of respite. That night, Abraham Lincoln and his wife Mary entered Ford's Theater to watch a light-hearted comedy, Our American Cousin. The house was full, laughter rolling through the crowd as actors moved across the stage. Lincoln, tall and weary, settled into the presidential box, a faint smile easing the lines of his face. Witnesses later said he looked more at peace than at any point in the war years. But as the play reached its height, a shadow moved behind him. John Wilkes Booth, actor turned assassin, slipped into the box. A single shot rang out, sharp, final, echoing above the laughter. Panic surged. Mary screamed. The nation's leader slumped forward, struck down at the very hour of triumph. Carried across the street to a boarding house, Lincoln lingered through the night. At dawn, the room was silent, but for the steady tick of a clock. When his breath ceased, a bystander whispered words that would resound through history. Now he belongs to the ages. The jubilation of victory gave way to grief. The Union, saved, now mourned its savior. Morning broke over Washington with a silence heavier than cannon smoke. News of Lincoln's death spread like wildfire, turning the capital's jubilation into mourning. Crowds gathered in stunned disbelief, their cheers of victory now replaced with sobs and prayers. Church bells tolled, draped in black crepe, while newspapers cried out in grief. The savior of the Union was gone. In the days that followed, the nation watched as his body was carried by train from Washington to Springfield. At every town along the route, thousands lined the tracks. Farmers, soldiers, freedmen, children, standing in the rain, hats pressed to their hearts, watching the funeral car pass in solemn silence. They did not simply bury a president. They buried a hope, a vision unfinished. And yet, Lincoln's death transformed him. The log cabin boy, the rail splitter, The reluctant politician, the wartime president, now became martyr, symbol, and legend. His words took on new weight, no longer speeches, but scripture. The House divided, the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, the Second Inaugural, all resonated with an almost prophetic urgency. Lincoln's legacy lies not in flawless perfection, but in human perseverance. His awkward gait, his melancholy silences, his compromises and doubts, these made his triumphs real. He carried the scars of division and offered, in return, a vision of reconciliation. And so we return to that image of Lincoln in the lamplight, pen in hand, the nation's burdens pressing on his shoulders. He did not ask for glory. He asked for understanding. He did not seek conquest, but unity. His life and his death leave us with a question that endures. How can a divided people remain one?